Welcome! Thank you very much for coming for the event Book and Talk with Professor Magocsi and Peter Johnsson. It's a very big honor to be able to host it here at Paideia, and we are very honored that we can have this event, which is created in a cooperation with the Ukrainian Institute in Sweden, the Ukrainian Jewish Institute, Encounter, the Paideia, the European Institute for Jewish Studies, Paideia, the Jewish community, and Paideia. Hopefully I didn't forget anyone. I try to memorize. Because you can see I'm not the best speaker in the world, so I will give the word to my colleague from the Ukrainian Institute in Sweden, Natalia Pasichnyk.
Thank you so much, Ivana. We are really very happy to be here today. It's our first time and our first cooperation, and we really think it's not the last one. And I am extra personally glad to see so many people today, and that you could come here today, because it shows that there is a big interest for this subject. And this subject has not been highlighted so much professionally, maybe sometimes emotionally, but not professionally. And it's such a huge subject, it's like endless field of exploration, and we really hope that this event is just a first attempt in this exciting work. And I would like to introduce our partners, our guests from Canada and United States. Organization Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. We are really very happy that you are here today with us. And I would like to welcome Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Director of Communications, Ms. Natalia Feduschak.
Thank you. Well, it's so wonderful to see all of you here. This is my first time in Stockholm and Professor Magocsi's second, and it's really a very beautiful city. We're enchanted. I wanted to just take a few minutes to tell you about Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. We are a privately funded Canadian nonprofit. This is our 10th year in existence now, and UJE was established with the goal of building better relations and a dialogue between Ukrainians and Jews. In the last decade, we've had a great deal of events. Just to highlight some of our more recent activity, we recently we sponsored the 75th year anniversary, the commemoration of Babin Yar. Professor Magocsi was in charge of this program. It was made up of 4 components. We have also, in the last several years, had what is known as a shared historical narrative, where we have brought scholars and specialists from around the world to talk about Ukrainian Jewish relations in different periods and to come up to some sort of a common narrative on that. We have also participated in book fairs and festivals. Coming soon will be works by the late Aharon Appelfeld and Amos Oz in Ukrainian. And of course, a very important book that we produced was Jews and Ukrainians, a Millennium of Coexistence. This book has been several years in the making. Professor Magocsi has now been traveling throughout North America, Ukraine, and recently we have started traveling through European capitals to talk about this very important subject. And it's a fantastic book, and I hope for those of you who will purchase a book, it is in the back there, will certainly enjoy it. I invite everybody to please visit our website, ukrainianjewishencounter.org, to find out more about our activities and also our Facebook page. So I give the floor back to Natalia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Before we go to talk itself, I would like to give some musical experience for you. It's a musical performance of music by from the region of Ukraine, where, as I know, the highest percentage of Jews lived before the Second World War. And the region is known as Galician or Halachina. And Mykola Kolesa, the composer who wrote this music, he both born and lived all his life and died in the city of Lviv, which is the biggest city in this region. And he based his music on folk melodies, on folklore from the people living in Lviv. And according to my language, was like more than 60-70% of Jews were living in Lviv. So when you listen to these three dances, you cannot really understand if it's Ukrainian or Jewish melody he meant, because this interaction, cultural interaction is so strong that sometimes you really cannot understand which is which. The music will be performed by two promising rising stars in Sweden, Iryna Serotiuk and Wojciech Sokolowski. Thank you very much, Wojciech and Iryna. I would like to welcome to this stage famous Swedish writer, historian, journalist, and foremost expert in history, in East European history, Peter Johnsson. For a couple of years ago, we had an honor to present his book, Ukraine in History. It's the first solid work which is written about Ukraine, which explore the cause and effect connections from ancient time to the modern time. And I really encourage you to go to internet and find this book, because this is the only one so long book in Swedish language written about Ukraine. So welcome, Peter Johnsson.
Thank you very much. And I have the honor to present for you a very well-known professor from Canada, specialist in Ukrainian history, Paul Robert Magocsi, who will be my accompaniment here for talking about this new book. Professor Magocsi has written several books about Ukrainian history. One of them I also read when writing my much smaller books. It was a mastodont work about the whole Ukrainian history. And lately several also other books. I know you told me about one book about Crimea lately, yes. But this book, which we are going to talk about today, is the coexistence of Jews and Ukrainians through 1,000 years. Yeah. A very, very beautiful books about a lot of themes in this long history of those two nations. But please come up to me as an audience. Welcome once more. The book you have written it together with a colleague, yes, Jonas Petrovsky Stern, who represents, so to say, the Jewish nation in this book you have written together. Yeah. It's a beautiful book with a lot of illustrations, many pictures and many things which I have never seen before. Yeah. The text itself in this book is narrative, yeah, descriptive. Sometimes I would say even encyclopedic. For instance, the chapters about music, architecture, and so on. And in the foreword to the book, you have written, and I quote you, "We as authors have chosen to be narrators, not polemicists." And my question is, can you tell us about the background of this project, and why did you choose to be, as you said, narrators? Did you have a purpose with this book?
First of all, everyone can, good. If not, I can do it without the microphone. But it might be easy, particularly for those in the back. I guess the simple answer to that question would be that the scholars in the humanities in particular, well, I guess scholars in general, shouldn't be representing anyone else but themselves as individuals. So, for instance, it would be difficult to really accept the proposition that Johann Piotrowski Stern represents the Jewish people or the Jewish component in the book, or that I somehow represent the Ukrainian component, assuming that either one or the other of us is Jewish or Ukrainian. But even if we were, that is not the job of a scholar. The job of a scholar is to study a particular issue and to present it in the most impartial way. A lot of people like to use the term objective, but it's next to impossible to be objective, but one should try to be impartial, and to try to do so in a way in which you step out of your own persona, try to rid yourself of all of your own personal baggage, which may be somehow related to the given topic, but does not necessarily have to be. I'm not of Crimean Tatar background, but I've written about Crimean Tatars as an example. And when one comes to a topic, as some of them, as many topics are, in the history or an area that has seen difficulties, that we felt that the best way to do this was in fact to try to not only study issues but present them to the public, to our readers, without any preconceived notions and without any particular political, religious, national, as one would say, axe to grind. It may sound like an idealistic approach to a subject, but as a scholar, this should be the only approach, I would say. So writing this book, in a sense, was no different from writing any other book that one has done in one's career.
The book begins with a short history, you can say, of the Ukrainian lands, yeah. And then there are different topics which you take up in different chapters: art, theater, architecture, folklore, even dressings, and so on, yeah. So it's a very, very broad book. And when I read it through, then I had the feeling that there were certain parts of the book, in certain chapters, where you had the feeling that those two nations, which are different nations, had more easy to meet each other, yeah. And one of the chapters is for sure the music, as Natalia said before, as we can hear. And I think also in architecture, art, and perhaps there are also other some points in this long history where those two nations could meet more easy than in other parts. Have you an answer to that question, or?
Well, you've both posed a question and provided a suggested answer.
No, the question is also why.
Thank you. Okay, fine. Because otherwise I would say thank you very much. Next question. Why? Well, I guess it's a somewhat. It's also, I would think, not a necessarily difficult question to ask, because another area which is touched on in this book is cuisine, food. If people live cheek to jowl on the same territory, in the same towns or villages, inevitably they have to interact with each other. And even at first glance, one may think that, oh, these are two different peoples because they have two different religions in this particular case, or these are two different peoples because they have two different languages. You know, there were obviously Poles who lived in large numbers in Western Ukraine, that somehow these people are intrinsically different. Well, actually, we well know that most humanities, there are already so many natural affinities between us as human beings, and then all you have to do is be living in the same physical space for, in this case, centuries. It's inevitable that there's going to be interaction, borrowings, certainly in the realm of everyday life, of which food, dress, music, and living quarters, architecture. We know that ethnic Ukrainians in some parts of the country build wooden churches, and so we also have wooden synagogues. For people from the outside world, it looks the same, actually. You walk inside, well, okay, so there's religious differences because there's Hebrew script as opposed to Old Church Slavonic or Church Slavonic, but nonetheless, physical proximity inevitably is going to lead to mutual cultural influences. Now, I guess at this particular point I might say that, and hopefully this does not preempt one of your questions, but if it does, it would have to be answered anyway. But this is not a book, this is not a history. This is not a, well, okay, I'll come back to that in a second. What it is not, is it is not a history of Jews in Ukraine. Right? It is a book about ethnic Ukrainians and Jews living on the territory of Ukraine, as well as their descendants living in the diaspora, where they also lived next to each other. They couldn't get away from each other, I guess. Certainly this is the case in Northeast United States. Is there a chapter on what we would think is typical history, that is discussing the political evolution of ethnic Ukrainians and Jews on the territory of Ukraine? Yes, there is, but it's only one of 12 chapters. The point being is that if you want to understand a given society, and certainly if you want to understand some of the peoples who live in a particular physical space, you cannot do that, you cannot fully understand it through kind of classic political interaction. Because most people don't function that way. Most people function by getting up in the morning, by eating, by going to work in a public space, by interacting with their fellow workers, whomever they may be, by enjoying themselves, by having weddings, or the typical life cycle matters, which may be related to a church or a synagogue, etc. And so if you really want to understand the society, one should look at political history last, not first. There's a whole school of French historiography, the Annales school, which you can do without political history entirely. So it's in that sense that this book takes this kind of approach, which some may say, oh, well, why is there so much in this book about art and music and sculpture, theater, literature, language. Well, excuse me, that's all history. I mean, actually, everything is history. So that's how I would kind of link that to your previous question.
Thank you very much, Professor Magocsi. And I think this is one of the strengths of this book, that you take up all those questions, all those chapters. And I put that kind of questions in the beginning because it is necessary to understand that people who are living together, as you say, for centuries in the same geographical area, they must interact with each other, and they must adapt to each other and learn from each other. Yeah? But then, also in the very beginning of the book, you have something which you call stereotypes, perceptions, and misperceptions. And you put up some, I would say, core questions in Ukrainian history where there are big disputes between those two nations, yes. Totally different understanding of history and remembrance of the history, as the Cossack uprising, Khmelnytsky uprising, and so on. Can you tell us something about those, the most important stereotypes which those two nations have in the conception of how they remember the history of Ukraine?
Well, I guess I would say again that we all, as human beings, have preconceived notions about everything. So we have stereotypes about our fellow citizens, we have stereotypes about ourselves, we have stereotypes about our country, our countries, and so that there are stereotypes on the part of ethnic Ukrainians vis-a-vis the Jews, or Jews vis-a-vis Ukrainians is no particular surprise. It's quite normal. I mean, we could have lists of stereotypes of ethnic Ukrainians and Poles, or Jews and Poles. Go down the list. What we felt was useful is to at least give examples of how the natural phenomenon of humans having stereotypical perceptions of others may at some times be treated lightly as a joke or as fun, but that sometimes they, in given circumstances, can be dangerous. And so we thought it would be useful to just get some of these up front, out in the very beginning, on the second, as you say, on the second and third page of the book, to already prompt people to think that, oh, well, I maybe somehow knew, heard, or perceived that this is the way it was, from my perspective, and in this particular case, from a Jewish perspective. And then they're forced to see right next to it the same event or the same phenomenon perceived by the other side of the thing, about which they probably never knew or never thought of. And so the very exercise of forcing people to confront stereotypes from the outset forces them to start thinking, and maybe forces them to read further in the book to see whether one side of that stereotypical bifurcation, as you see, whether one side is correct and the other side is not correct, or more likely, both sides are incorrect because they're just stereotypes. So that's why we decided to put them up front from the very outset.
Yeah. And if we take one of those stereotypes, I think the first mentioned in this list which you have here, it concerns the Cossack uprising against the Polish state in the 17th century by Hetman Khmelnytsky,
Right.
who is a national liberator for the Ukrainians, perhaps even a state builder, and someone who killed Jews from the Jewish point of view. But even you present those 2 points, here first, perhaps we have an explanation why the Ukrainians in this case didn't like the Jews, because they had a special mission in this multi-ethnic society in which they were living, as an intermediary between the Polish landlords and the Ukrainians. But my question is, you put this on the table, but if I read further in the book, do I find an answer or not?
Well, as I said to you earlier today, you know this book better than I, because you've read it just once, and you said a second time recently. I only wrote a portion of it, and some time ago. I'm not trying to not answer the question. So let me then kind of commented on it this way. And I can't remember whether this very specificity of that issue is addressed in any detail in the subsequent narrative. But I'll elaborate right now a bit on the stereotype is, on the one hand, that this was, as said in the Encyclopedia Judaica that was published in the 1960s, that during this Khmelnytsky uprising, led by Khmel the Wicked, upwards of 300,000 Jews were killed on the territory of Ukraine, wiped out totally the Jewish communities, and was the first example of a genocidal act against Jews. This is what the Encyclopedia Judaica said back in the 1970s. The general view of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, not Khmel the Wicked, but Bogdan Khmelnytsky, from the standpoint of ethnic Ukrainians, is that he was leading and became the head of an uprising against Polish-Lithuanian rule, the oppression of the landlords in a feudal society, and that it's thanks to him that Polish rule was eliminated on this territory. And for ethnic Ukrainians, he then becomes the first example of a national leader and a national hero. There's also a kind of quirky twist, because not all ethnic Ukrainians appreciate Bogdan Khmelnytsky, including the most famous writer of Ukraine, the national bard of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko, who detests Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And he detests Bogdan Khmelnytsky because, on the one hand, Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a revolt to quote-unquote liberate his people from Polish rule, but then accepted the authority of the Tsar of Muscovy, which led then on the downhill slope toward Muscovite and then later Russian control of Ukraine, and for all of what that implied and meant. Well, we now know that all of this idea of Khmelnytsky, if we're looking at the Ukrainian stereotype, as a national leader who was just waiting for the moment so that he could lead an uprising against Poles and liberate Ukrainian peasants, we know that this is far from the truth. Because Bogdan Khmelnytsky, all really he wanted to do is get himself and his social class recognized as Polish nobility. And in fact remained loyal to the King of Poland until he couldn't convince them anymore. And whereas the king actually in this particular political structure was more malleable, the rest of the Polish nobles didn't want to have anything to do with this rabble. Well, these Rus, these are not worthy of even sitting at the same table as us. So it's not like he didn't want to stay within Poland, right? That he suddenly was, from the very beginning, leading this uprising. Why is this important? Because actually, in the end, he had very little control over this uprising. He got totally out of hand. This is not the modern world where he sits, or any leader in the 17th century sits somewhere and gives orders and they're carried out because there's a telegram that's sent or so forth and so on. He had little control of what's going on in the countryside. And you have uprisings of peasants, etc., which lead to the kind of destruction, which, by the way, the goal of the peasantry and those peasant uprisings and those Cossacks who were leading them, their goal was not the Jews. They had just happened to be there. Their goal was the Polish nobility, burning down estates of Polish nobility, killing all the Polish nobility that had oppressed them. And in particular, Roman Catholic priests. And then even worse, those Ukrainians who entered into union with the Catholic Church, which were even worse than the Poles and the Jews, because they were turncoats. The Jews were just got, swept up in an elemental, as the French would say, jacquerie. It's not specifically singled out. And then the numbers. If we look now on the side of the Jewish stereotype, the idea that there were 300,000 Jews killed came from a famous author called Nathan of Hanover, which, by the way, this is discussed, I now believe.
This you mentioned.
And sometimes I'm mixed up because in my history of Ukraine, all of this is discussed at great length, so I can't remember what was done here, and of course, it's much shorter. But in any case, that's where that figure come from. And it was already a typical one of these tropes of the early modern era where, you pick a number and then it becomes the sacred number that everyone... Well, actually, Israeli scholars, within the last 25 years, have begun to look at this in great detail by studying Jewish communities, by studying also in Greek the amount of people who worked on estates, because there are records of various kinds. Well, it actually turns out that the consensus on the part of Jewish scholarship, not Ukrainian scholarship, the consensus on the part of Jewish scholarship, that there was only between 15,000 and 18,000. Not 100,000, certainly not 150,000, certainly not 300,000. And we also know that the Jewish community not only then survived, but thrived and grew 2 or 3 times in size by the early 18th century, by 50 years later. Well, if they were all exterminated or killed, where did they come from? So this is just one example that I've spent a little more time on, but by the way, and now in terms of style of writing a book of this kind, which is meant as a popular book, I've just given you part of a scholarly lecture if we were talking about the Khmelnytsky period. This book is not a book of history. It is showing the interrelation, and we will simply make a statement about this based on our knowledge and experience and on a whole body of secondary literature. If someone wants to know more about this, they can look in the bibliography in the back and read more specifically. So,
thank you very much for this lecture on the 17th century history of Ukraine and the Cossack uprising and its speciality. And of course, I didn't expect that of all those stereotypes which you put up, this is only one of the Khmelnytsky uprising. Yeah, then you have the pogroms, the 30s history of Ukraine, the Second World War, the Holocaust, and so on. It would be impossible for you to write a book where you make, so to say, the academic discussions on all those topics. Then you have to publish 3 volumes, yes. But my question is perhaps to formulate it in another way. Because you put the stereotypes on the table, and in both cases, as you've shown clearly here, they are misperceptions. Yeah? I mean, we know that even 300,000 Jews didn't exist in the whole Ukrainian lands at that time, yeah? So they could not. But anyhow, you know that the 13th of Sivan is the 3rd month in the Jewish calendar, which will be the 27th of May. It's still a holiday, a fastening, you can say, in the Jewish calendar, relating to what happens during the uprising. Yeah. But my question perhaps goes a bit further. You put those on the table, and you can read the misperceptions or the different perceptions. Yeah? But if those 2 nations or representatives in diaspora in Ukraine shall come even closer, then they also have to discuss and to try, at least, to find some
consensus.
Sort of truth and some consensus. Yeah? So this is only, so to say, a beginning to build this consensus. Yes?
Yes. This is what happens when we're dealing with someone who knows what he's talking about. You see?
Thank you very much.
Because he not only read the book, he understands it.
We have been talking also during the
Yeah, right, but you already understood it.
No. Okay, but this was...
Makes my life very easy.
No, but this was your intention. This is my question also.
Of course it was our intention.
Yeah.
And you got it.
Yes, that's good. So let's go further. Yeah? There are 2 nations, the Jewish nation, which is one of the oldest nations in the world, yeah? And the Ukrainian nation, which is a rather new-built nation, as a conscious nation. Yeah? And they meet on the Ukrainian lands, yeah? Coming from, so to say, 2 different origins. Or one are immigrants and the other are indigenous from the Ukrainian lands. Yeah? Can you tell us something how the Ukrainian nation was formed in those lands, and why? How did it happen that so many millions of Jews in the 15th and 16th century were living in the Ukrainian lands? What is the historical background to this?
Let me begin by addressing a conceptual matter. The formulation that you just gave is stereotypical.
Thank you.
Namely, that, oh, well, here you have these 2 historic peoples. One of them has always been living on the territory of Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians, and then we have these newcomers or immigrants who came in, Jews at some point in history. Reminds me of when I was working on, I was a director of an institute in in Canada that was a government institution that studied immigration in Canada. And during my period, as the main project of the Institute, I became general editor of something called the Encyclopedia of Canada's Peoples. I had previously worked on the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, and now it's the Encyclopedia of Canada's Peoples. I might add, there were only a couple models in the world. There was the Harvard one, there was for the United States, there was one for Australia, and the other country that had an Encyclopedia of Peoples was Sweden. We followed this quite closely. And Canada, of course, with all this multiculturalism, didn't have one. So during my tenure, we produced 1,400 large-scale, 130 groups. Now Canada has this really strange situation of they have two founding nations, that is, the British and the French. And then it has the First Peoples, the Aboriginal peoples. And then there are all the others. Whether they came from Iceland or Sweden or Jews or Ukrainians, whatever, they're all, there are the founding nations, and then there are the indigenous nations. My friend, they're all immigrants. They all came to Canada from somewhere else. And in particular, in that sense, the English or the Scots or the Welsh or the French are no different. They are the equal in Canada of the Jews and the Swedes and the Icelanders or the Ukrainians or anyone. They're all immigrants. And of course we come to those indigenous peoples, those First Nations. Oh no, they have a special status. Excuse me, and as I wrote in the introduction, we should be referring to them as Siberian Canadians. Now they may have come 10,000 years ago, as opposed to 500 years ago or 200 years, but they came from somewhere else too. We're all immigrants. Analogously, the Slavic peoples, of which ethnic Ukrainians derive at present, on the territory of Ukraine, were not always living on the territory of Ukraine. Actually, in the far northwestern part, we're talking about the indigenous population that we know best about. The origin of the Slavs in general probably was in far northwestern Ukraine, southwestern Belarus and Poland. But in general, for most of Ukraine, they're immigrants too. They moved into this area at various times. So from that standpoint, and this is the important thing, all peoples living on the territory of Ukraine are equal in terms of their relationship to that country. And they should all be treated equally. Now, in answer to your specific question, how did the Jews get there as opposed to the Poles or the Rus or the Germans or somebody else? So we can talk about that. The answer to that is generally well known. That in the medieval period, in Europe, often very much connected to the Crusades, this fervor of medieval Christian belief, and blaming the Jews for having killed another Jew, Jesus Christ, right? So a Jew killed a Jew, but then they get blamed for killing another Jew because they killed the Savior, so to speak. And the Crusade period, as we well know, had heightened the ultimate stereotypes about Jews, and they started to be deported or exiled from the lands in which they live. Of course, the first country that exiled Jews in Europe was allegedly the font of modern liberal democracy. That was England, and then others caught up with them. And in the Germanic lands, that happened in the 12th century. But there was a safety valve where Jews could go. Why? Because Central European kingdoms, the Polish kingdom, the Hungarian kingdom, even at a stage the Bohemian kingdom, particularly the Polish kingdom and the Hungarian kingdom, the rulers needed people to develop their economies. And so they turned to peoples who had certain skills, in particular in mining and in higher level of agricultural productivity, in ability of finance and banking, etc. And so what did these kings do? The kings of Poland and the kings of Hungary did the same thing, but they invited whom? The peoples with better skills. And who were the people with the best skills? Germans, Armenians, and Jews. And they were invited and welcomed and given a whole host of privileges, special laws to protect their interests. They didn't have to pay taxes for a certain period of time, etc., etc. So for Jews, as for the Germans and the Armenians who came there, now you're asking me specifically about the Jews. The Jews were welcomed into Poland. For them, this was a paradise, and they first came into what is now present-day Poland, and then as Poland expanded eastward into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and that included Ukrainian lands. So they started coming into what is now present-day Ukrainian lands sometime in the late 1500s, the late 16th century. And they came together with the expansion of the Polish nobility, who themselves were opening up these large landed estates in order to get the agricultural wealth of Ukrainian lands and then export that to Northern Europe, which at the time had a lot of money to pay for exports from Poland, whether they were hides, whether they were grain, because countries like Portugal and Spain had just opened up the New World, brought in all of these, we had a lot of wealth, like a lot of gold and silver floating around, and so Poland took advantage of this, exported these products, and so the Jews became an integral part of the feudal structure led by the Polish nobility in what is now Ukrainian territory.
Thank you very much. I agree. I choose the word which is not fit for the Ukrainian, so to say, nations. Of course, you are right that all people have been wandering through those lands, including people from the country where we are sitting now. We have the Varandas, the Vikings.
Oh, yes.
But the history of the Jews coming as apart from the western part of Europe being thrown out from England, Germany, Spain, and so on during the 13th and 14th century. It's one part, but then there is a part of Jewish people, or perhaps Karaites, yes, which has another history. Can you tell about that?
Yeah.
And are they Jews?
Before speaking of the Karaites, there's another matter. The description that I just gave now, which represents the vast majority of Jews who settled in Ukrainian lands via Poland, coming from the Germanic Central Europe, were Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim. And they were the largest majority. But the Jewish presence on the territory of present-day Ukraine goes back to before the Common Era, because the southern part, all of the southern part of Ukraine, stretching from modern-day Odessa, Mykolaiv, certainly the Crimean Peninsula and the Sea of Azov, was first settled by Greek colonists in classical Greece. And so all of these places like Chersonesos, Pantikopeum, Olvia, Tira, these are all Greek settlements. And among those Greek settlements, already there were some Jews from the Mediterranean world. The Greek settlements were then replaced by Roman settlements when Rome created the great empire that it did throughout the the entire Mediterranean, and then an adjunct to that was the Black Sea. And then when Rome split and no longer existed in the West, then it became part of the Eastern or Byzantine Empire, all continued. And so there was a Jewish presence on Ukrainian territory going back a long time ago. And then when Jews were driven out of Spain, some of the Mediterranean Jews also came into that area. So we have Ladinos there as well. But those original Jews that settled in particular in those Crimean cities, going back to before the Common Era, developed a very specific culture, and they were the Jews of the Crimea, and they're called Krimchaks. And then when Crimea developed or came under both Ottoman Turkish and Crimean Tatar rule, the Jews adopted the Turkic language, written in Hebrew alphabet. So we have the original population, Jewish population of Crimea, as these Krimchaks going back to Greek settlements. Then we have also coming in from Iran a group of people of the book who are not rabbinic but still follow to a certain, and these are the so-called Karaites. Whether they are Jews or not, that's not for me to say. Most Jews don't consider Karaites Jews, and Karaites themselves don't consider themselves the same. Well, they don't consider themselves Jews, they're Karaites. And then we had a third edition. Later on in the 19th and particularly the 20th century, we had Ashkenazic Jews coming from the Russian Empire. Already there were settlement patterns, and then during the Soviet times there were specific settlement patterns. So there are actually minimally two Jewish communities, distinct Jewish communities in the southern part of Ukraine, in particular Crimea. That is the Krimchaks, the oldest, the Ashkenazi, the youngest, and then the Karaites are there as well. And that is, in fact, all described in this book. There's a whole section on the Karaites. Why? Because Crimea and Ukraine became the center, the major center of Karaite culture in the world. And there had some of our colleagues said, why are you including the Karaites here? Right, they're not Jews. Well, maybe they're not, but if you want to understand the total story of the Jewish presence in this area, clearly they have some kind of Jewish characteristics.
Sure.
So therefore they're in there.
Thank you. I think this is an explanation to make us understand that this history between Ukrainians and other peoples also in this vast territory is rather complicated and implies several factors. Yeah, and there is one person, of course, today which is well known who occupied Crimea, who had an idea about that. He went down to Sevastopol and said that this was the oldest Russian town here, which had existed for 1,000 years, not knowing that it was a Greek colony. Mr. Putin, of course. Yeah. Professor Magocsi, anyhow, we have those different groups of Jews which has taken part in the history going on these lands which today are Ukraine. But the majority of the Jews, they are connected with this, what happened during the 12th or 13th and 14th and 15th century Ashkenazis coming into the western parts. During the Polish-Lithuanian and afterwards the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and invited by the kings, and then moving eastwards when they more or less were thrown out of some towns in central Poland. And if you allow me to formulate a critical thought, which I could not avoid being created in my mind when I read the book, it is, if I should put it a bit provocative, is the question if you have had, has there been a danger that you have, so to say, Ukrainized overestimated the Ukrainization of the Jewish culture in this particular area, where they were sometimes the vast majority of people in most towns in this area. Yeah. If you take Brody, they were perhaps 70%, in Lviv and all those, yes. And the Jewish populations, which was, or the Ukrainian population, was perhaps in the whole Galicia 50% of the whole. But if you go to the towns, they were a small or a minority. Yeah. But then you had, as in Lviv, you had Greeks, you had Armenians, and so on. Yeah. So it was a multinational, multi-ethical, multi-religious society. Yeah. And